Tax impact for 401 method applies a 26% income tax rate at the conclusion of each 20-year investment period. Tax impact for brokerage method separately taxes dividends and capital gains, paying taxes on all capital gains from both principal and dividend reinvestment at the conclusion of each 20-year investment period and netting losses against any gains. Based on August 2021 levels of 30-year nominal bond yields. Part 2. How the world has worked over the last 500 years. Chapter 8. The last 500 years in a tiny nutshell. In Part 1, I described how I believe the perpetual motion machine works. In Part 2, I will show you what this perpetual motion machine has produced over the last 500 years of history. Just as I did in Part 1, I'll start by conveying everything in a tiny nutshell. This chapter will set the stage for the remaining chapters of Part 2, which will cover in detail how the big cycle played out in the Dutch, British, American, and Chinese cases. Finally, in Part 3, I will attempt to squint into the future by sharing with you what my model says about a number of the leading countries today. But before we get there, we need to go back to 1500 to get a better picture of what the world was like when this story begins. The world in 1500. The world was very different in 1500, yet it operated the same way it does now. That's because while things have evolved a lot since 1500, they've done so in the same ways they always have, with evolutionary uptrends producing advancements and big cycles creating swings and bumps around the uptrends. A few of the most important ways that the world was different in 1500 were: the world was much bigger then. 500 years ago, one could travel about 25 miles in a day on horseback. Today it is possible to travel to the other side of the world in the same amount of time. The Apollo astronauts traveled to the moon and back much faster than it took a traveler to get from Paris to Rome in 1500. As a result, the geographic areas of relevance, example, who could impact whom, were much smaller, so the world seemed much bigger. Europe was one world, Russia was another, and China and the areas around it were an even more remote world. States that in retrospect seem tiny and numerous did not seem that way at all at the time. Because national boundaries didn't exist as they do today, there were almost constant GHTS with neighbors over wealth and power in their neighborhoods. But in 1500, that picture was changing quickly. The European powers were well into their age of exploration, which was led by the Portuguese and the Spanish and brought them into contact with faraway empires. Like all periods of great evolution, the age of exploration was enabled by technological developments that could make people rich. In this case, the invention of ships that could travel the world to accumulate riches by trading with and taking wealth from those who the explorers encountered. At the time, wealthy rulers funded the expeditions in exchange for a share of the bounty that the explorers brought back with them. Countries didn't exist; instead, territories were run by families. Back in 1500, there were no sovereign states with borders and ruling orders. They hadn't been invented yet. Instead, there were big family estates called kingdoms and dynasties run by kings and emperors that almost constantly fought with their neighbors for wealth and power. When a kingdom conquered, grew, and encompassed enough area, it was called an empire. Because the ruling order was centered around families, kingdoms and dynasties at that time could inherit other lands if their rulers died and there was no closer relative, similar to how one would inherit property, or a family company today. Arranged marriages were logical ways the empire could stay in the hands of a tighter family group rather than branching out and dissipating over the generations. Religions and religious leaders were much more powerful, and science as we know it today didn't exist. In most of the world, the elites consisted of monarchs who supposedly gained their power from the divine, the clergy who represented the divine, and the landowning nobles who oversaw the peasants and largely treated them like oxen working the land. The monarchs had ministers, bureaucracies, and militaries that controlled and defended their territories for them. Though the Europeans and the Chinese were on opposite sides of the world and had virtually no contact with each other, they operated in essentially the same way, though China's institutions were bigger, more developed, and less religious than Europe's. The world was much less egalitarian. The ideas that A, all people should be treated equally, and B, judged by the law didn't exist at the time. This was true both within kingdoms and between them. In both cases, power through arms and violence ruled the day. Up until the 1300s and 1400s, serfdom existed in most of Western Europe, which meant that the only way for most people to assert their power was through revolt. While this had largely changed by 1500, the rights awarded to common people remained weak until the Enlightenment in the 1700s. The world's empires in 1500. Europe. The Habsburg family dynasty controlled Spain and all the territories that Spain controlled, plus a collection of territories that formed the Holy Roman Empire. This included parts of what we now call the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Germany, and Austria. It was the Western world's most powerful empire. The Valois family dynasty, which was the main rival to the Habsburgs, controlled France. This led to a lot of fighting between the families. The Tudor dynasty controlled England, which was not yet an important force in Europe though it was growing in strength. Florence, Venice, and Milan, which were frequently run as republics with prominent families, were where the action was. Most of the financial, commercial, intellectual, and artistic innovation coming out of Europe in 1500 originated in these states. They were very rich and played a central role in shaping Europe and the Western world at this time and for centuries to come because of the revolutionary ideas they fostered, ideas I will explore in more detail later. The Papal States were run by the Pope and the Catholic Church. Throughout Christian Europe, relationships between monarchs, nobles, and the Church followed the typical formula of elites working in mutually supportive ways to drive the ruling orders to their benat. As a result of this, the Church acquired vast wealth, which it got mostly from poor peasants who gave money to the Church and worked without pay on Church agricultural lands. The Rurik dynasty, and later the Romanovs, ruled Russia, which was a peripheral power at the time and seemed remote to Europeans. The Ottoman Empire, named after its ruling family, was centered in Constantinople, which it had conquered in 1453. Additionally, there were many hundreds, perhaps thousands, of family-run states across Europe. They fought all the time because each had to constantly defend and GHG one's neighbors. Allies and enemies were always important and constantly changing. This map shows the major powers in Europe in 1550. There were many more small states we couldn't see on this map. Asia. The Ming dynasty controlled almost all of China and was the most advanced and powerful empire in the world. Like European empires, it was family-controlled with an emperor who had the mandate of heaven. The emperor oversaw a bureaucracy that was run and protected by ministers and military leaders who worked in symbiotic, though sometimes contentious, relationships with landowning noble families who oversaw peasant workers. In 1500 the Ming dynasty was approaching its peak and was leaps and bounds ahead of Europe in wealth, technology, and power. It had enormous cultural and political influence all over East Asia and Japan. At the time, Confucian scholars were then seen to be near the top of the social hierarchy, which helped them get ahead in politics. To get ahead, one needed to study Confucianism in depth and pass highly competitive exams. Political decisions were frequently based on rulers' interpretations of Confucian ideals. Neo-Confucianism, which was dominant at the time, shifted the focus of the belief system toward a more rational, philosophical, academic, and humanistic form. This way of thinking, which was practical, evidence-based, and scientific, was a key reason China pulled so far ahead of Europe in the Middle Ages. At the time, scholars and scientists had significant power, which led to remarkable technological advances. Literacy rates were extremely high relative to other places at the time, and China was also advanced in medicine. For example, it had a widespread program of guiding smallpox infection via an early form of vaccination, centuries before Europe. Its financial system was relatively well developed with early forms of corporations and banks, a history of using printed money, and relatively sophisticated financial markets. And it was militarily very strong. The Ming dynasty had the largest navy in the world and a standing army of 1 million troops. In his wonderful book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, historian Paul Kennedy described it well. Of all the civilizations of pre-modern times, none appeared more advanced, none felt more superior than that of China. Its considerable population, 130 million compared with Europe's 55 million in the 15th century, Its remarkable culture, its exceedingly fertile and irrigated plains, linked by a splendid canal system since the 11th century, and its hierarchic administration run by a well-educated Confucian bureaucracy had given a coherence and sophistication to Chinese society which was the envy of foreign visitors. Ironically and typically, the enormity of the Ming dynasty's wealth and power is one possible explanation of what eventually led to its fall. Believing that they did not need anything else, the emperors put an end to China's exploration of the world, closed its doors, and retired to lives of pleasure, and turned over the running of government to their ministers and eunuchs, which led to dysfunctional inguiding, corruption, weakness, and vulnerability to attack. There was a shift away from pragmatic scientific study and innovation toward pedantic scholarship. As we'll see in Chapter 12, this helped drive the decline of China relative to Europe. Across the rest of Asia, the story in 1500 was one of fragmentation. India was divided among several kingdoms, including the Delhi Sultanate in the north and the Hindu Vijayanagara Empire in the south. It was not an empire of note, though it was about to be, as in the 1520s the Mughal Empire began its conquest of India, eventually leading it to be among the world's most powerful. Likewise, Japan in 1500 was divided into many entities, experienced civil war, and was isolated, so it too was not a power of note. The Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, mentioned before, also came to control much of the Middle East by the mid-1500s, with a key rival in the new Safavid dynasty of Persia. The Americas. The largest empires were the Aztec Empire centered in Mexico and the Incan Empire in South America. But soon the Europeans arrived, devastating both powers and leading to the emergence of new colonies, including the seedlings of what would become the United States 276 years later. Africa. A vast continent 3 times bigger than Europe was divided into dozens of kingdoms, often separated by large, sparsely populated areas. The biggest in the year 1500 was the Songhai Empire in West Africa, which had a reputation as a center of trade and Islamic scholarship. That was the lay of the land in 1500. The world order was about to change in very big ways. What has happened since 1500? As you might imagine, there are far too many important things that have happened since 1500 for me to tee into this tiny nutshell. However, I can hit the highlights of the story of how the world changed from 1500 until now, with an emphasis on the key themes and shifts I will be expanding on in the following chapters. The most important changes were the changes in thinking that led to people changing behaviors, particularly about how wealth and power should be shared. They were what made this story transpire as it did. It is easy to identify the biggest periods of change because they are generally called revolutions and ages. When reading this short summary of the last 500 years, notice both the evolutions and the cycles. You will see that there were both several revolutions and ways of thinking that led to tremendous evolution and progress over hundreds of years, and 2, many cycles of peaceful and prosperous periods alternating with depressions and wars that marked the ends of old orders and beginnings of new. Once, the Commercial Revolution. The Commercial Revolution was the move away from a solely agriculture-based economy to one that included trade in a variety of goods. This evolution began in the 12th century, and by 1500, it was centered in the Italian city-states due to a confluence of 2 factors that enabled them to become territorially wealthy. First, the wars between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire significantly slowed land trade between Europe and the rest of the world, which created a significant opening for maritime trade. Second, a number of Italian city-states developed republican governments modeled after the Roman Republic. Their governments were more inventive and responsive than those in the rest of Europe, which allowed a strong merchant class to develop. Venice was a prime example of this, as its governance system was designed with multiple checks and balances to ensure that there was a more meritocratic approach to government than existed in the rest of Europe. Venice's leader, called the Doge, did not have the right to name a successor and was restricted from bringing family members into government. New doges were chosen by vote by a series of committees whose members, in some cases, were chosen by lot from among several hundred aristocratic families. The Italians produced well-functioning capital markets, supported by new advances in bookkeeping and impartial institutions to enforce contracts. While private and government borrowing were new, leading up to 1500, they tended to take place as bilateral deals between wealthy citizens, and defaults on creditors were extremely common. Because those who made money from trade, the merchant class, could benefit from a well-functioning financial system in which savings could be put into investments that fueled productivity, they created a number of financial innovations, including credit markets. With the proceeds from trade owing in and a need for standardized coinage, coins minted in the Italian city-states, especially Florence's gold orin, were of solid value, were well recognized as such, and, as a result, began to be accepted as global currencies. On the basis of their solid currencies, these city-states developed active lending and a publicly traded bond market. Venice established a perpetual bond early in the 12th century with a 5% coupon that the government would either issue or purchase back depending on the finance's needs of the time. Venice's merchants owned the bonds and had significant influence on the government, so default could only be a last resort. The centuries in which the bond existed without defaults gave lenders condenke in it, and institutions for trading bonds in secondary markets made it a liquid form of investment. The ability to borrow quickly at reasonable rates was an enormous boon to Venice. Though Venice eventually defaulted after losing a series of wars around 1500, liquid bond markets caught on elsewhere, including in the Netherlands and in the UK. The Renaissance. A new way of thinking in many respects modeled after the ancient Greeks and Romans started in Italian city-states around 1300 and passed through Europe until the 1600s, in a period known as the Renaissance. Renaissance thinkers made a big pivot toward using logical reasoning instead of divine intention as the way to explain how the world works. This shift contributed to dizzyingly fast discoveries that led to artistic and technological advances in Europe. It began in the city-states of northern Italy, where the commercial revolution had created riches that led to advances in trade, production, and banking enabled by intellectualism and creativity. The Renaissance was one of history's greatest cases of a self-reinforcing cycle I described in Chapter 5, peaceful periods in which creativity and commerce reinforce each other to produce an economic boom and great advancements. In the middle of it, and propelling it forward, were people and families like the Medici, who were merchants and bankers, not feudal kings. They used their riches to support the arts, architecture, and science. Alongside the flourishing in art and architecture were huge advances in science, technology, and business. Knowledge and ideas spread rapidly because of the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century. By the way, many of the European Renaissance innovations had already been in place in China for centuries because the Chinese discovered the key elements to produce it, e.g., the printing press, the scientific method, and the meritocratic placements of people in jobs, much earlier. One can think of China's Neo-Confucianism, described earlier, as being like China's Renaissance because, as in Europe's Renaissance, it led to more logic and evidence-based thinking and more inventive rather than religious worldviews. As the new ideas spread across Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, luminaries such as Shakespeare and Francis Bacon in England, Descartes in France, and Erasmus in the Netherlands had broad impacts. Living standards rose dramatically, though much more for the elites than for peasants. In Italy, this period of relative peace and prosperity eventually led to excesses, decadence, and decline as the city-states became less competitive and their financial conditions deteriorated. The Age of Exploration and Colonialism. The Age of Exploration began in the 1400s when Europeans traveled all over the world in search of wealth, creating widespread contact between many different peoples for the RST time and beginning to shrink the world. It roughly coincided with the Renaissance because the technological marvels of the Renaissance translated into advancements in shipbuilding and navigation, and the riches that those ships brought back enhanced further Renaissance advancements. Ruling families supported these money-making explorations and split the proceeds with explorers. For example, Henry the Navigator, the brother of the head of the Portuguese royal family, sponsored some of the earliest voyages and established a trading empire in Africa and Asia. Spain followed suit, swiftly conquering and colonizing significant portions of the Western Hemisphere, including the precious metal-rich Aztec and Incan empires. Though Portugal and Spain were rivals, the unexplored world was huge, and when they had disputes, they were successfully mediated. Spain's integration into the Habsburg Empire and its control over highly profitable silver mines made it stronger than Portugal in the 1500s, and for a roughly 60-year period starting in the late 1500s the Habsburg king ruled Portugal as well. Both translated their wealth into golden ages of art and technology. The Spanish Empire grew so large it became known as the empire on which the sun never sets, an expression that would later be used to describe the British Empire. As European nations found ways to make their explorations more profitable, the rise of global trade transformed their economies. Most notably, the flow of new riches to Europe fueled a rise in prices for basic goods and services. Referred to as the Spanish Price Revolution, Europe went from hundreds of years of steady prices to a doubling of prices every few decades, a reminder of how big shifts can have economic impacts that seem unimaginable based on one's most recent experiences. Eventually, this push toward exploration led Europe to trade with and exploit Asia, most notably China, Japan, and the Indian subcontinent. The Portuguese were the first of these explorers to approach China in 1513, though other European explorers like Marco Polo had been in contact before. Europeans were dazzled by the quality of Chinese porcelain, silk, and other goods, which became highly sought after, but the Chinese weren't interested in buying European goods, which they considered inferior. However, they eagerly accepted silver, which was money in China as well as in Europe, as payment. As we'll cover later, China struggled for centuries with shortages of the precious metals it needed to have a science supply of money. However, the Europeans didn't have enough silver to trade and the Chinese weren't interested in other goods, which eventually led to the Opium Wars and other interesting stories that we will explore later. China's Ming Dynasty had its own version of the Age of Exploration but abandoned it. Starting in the early 1400s, Ming Dynasty Emperor Yongle empowered his most trusted admiral, Xing He, to lead 7 major naval expeditions, treasure voyages, around the world. Though not colonizing expeditions, these naval missions helped project China's power abroad. Yongle's navy was the largest and most sophisticated in the world, featuring larger and better constructed ships than any country in Europe would produce for at least a century. China's international influence, as indicated by the number of foreign cities engaged in formal tributary relationships with the mainland, increased rapidly. However, the Ming emperors chose to end these voyages and pulled the empire into itself. It remains a matter of conjecture whether that is because Yongle's military and naval expeditions were expensive or because the emperors believed that they had all they needed within China, so there was no need for this exploration. The result of this pullback was an age of isolationism in China and in Japan as well, where it was called Sakoku. For the next several centuries, China and Japan broadly moved away, in TS and starts, from openness toward foreigners and toward distance and isolation. The Reformation. Beginning in the 1500s in Europe, Protestant religious movements initiated a revolution against the Roman Catholic Church, which contributed to a series of wars and the bringing down of the then existing European order. As previously explained, at the time, the existing order consisted of monarchs, nobles, and the church in symbiotic relationships. The Reformation took aim at the power and corruption of the Roman Catholic Church and sought an independent religion in which people dealt with God directly rather than one mediated by the Church's rules. At the time, many Catholic bishops and other senior clergy lived like princes in palaces, and the Church sold indulgences. The Roman Catholic Church was a nation as much as it was a religion, directly governing a sizable share of modern Italy. The Reformation started in 1517, when Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, challenging the papal monopoly on the interpretation of the Bible and on papal power in general. When he refused to recant his ideas, he was declared a heretic and excommunicated. His ideas, and those of other theologians, nonetheless took hold in large parts of Europe, thanks to the political support of key nobles, as well as the new printing press technology. That move, together with the usual constant guiding for power, broke down the existing European world order. In virtually all the major Christian powers, the immediate impact of the Reformation was increased internal ICT and instability, and the instability extended between countries too. The wars of religion were intertwined with the wars against the existing orders and existing elites. They included an extended civil war in France in which an estimated 3 million people died and later contributed to an extended civil war in the UK. In the end, the Reformation led to Protestants earning substantial rights and freedoms. It also undermined the power of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs, left Germany with deep divisions that would continue to build through the end of the incredibly brutal 30 Years' War in the mid-1600s, and led to civil wars for over 100 years. As is typical, the Big War led to a new order, which was followed by a period of peace and prosperity. The New World Order following the 30 Years' War. On its surface, the 30 Years' War pitted Protestant countries against Catholic ones. However, the full story was more complicated, with wider geopolitical interests related to wealth and power playing a role of who lined up with whom. At the end of the war, the new order was laid out at the Peace of Westphalia. The most important breakthroughs that came from it were the establishment of geographic borders and the sovereign rights of the people within those borders to decide what happens in their domains. Like most periods after major wars and the establishment of new orders, there was an extended time of peace between countries, with the Dutch emerging from the chaos as the leading global economic power. However, the battles for wealth and power, most importantly between declining monarchies and their subjects, continued across the continent. The invention of capitalism. Beginning with the Dutch, the development of publicly available and popularly used equity markets allowed savers to actively transfer their buying power to entrepreneurs who could put that buying power to productive and profitable use. This significantly improved the allocation of resources and was stimulative to economies because it produced new buying power. It also produced the capital markets cycles. While there were many elements involved in the creation of capitalism, a series of related economic and financial developments, most notably the developments of publicly traded stock and bond markets such as the opening of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange in 1602 and the Bank of England's RST government bond issuance in 1694, are associated with it. Along with the advances of the Scientific Revolution, the invention of capitalism was a key reason behind the shift from slow real GDP growth to the faster growth. As seen in the chart I showed in Chapter 1. We will explore this innovation and its tremendous impact in more detail in the following chapter. The Scientific Revolution. The Scientific Revolution was an extension of the Renaissance-era shift from ding truth and religion to ding truth and logical reasoning and the Reformation's drive to question authority and think for oneself. These factors led to the development of the scientific method, which improved humanity's understanding of the world, establishing protocols by which scientific discoveries could be investigated and proven and ushering in many discoveries that raised living standards. The scientific method was pioneered by Francis Bacon in the early 1600s, though many important advances in astronomy, particularly the work of Copernicus and Galileo, took place earlier, in the 1500s. These discoveries vastly expanded European knowledge about the solar system for the RST times since the Greco-Roman period and were paralleled by many others across anatomy, mathematics, physics, and many other fields. European governments began to support and sponsor this research, with the most famous example being the Royal Society in the UK, which was founded in 1660 and proved instrumental in promoting the exchange of ideas and discoveries. Over the centuries to come, the discoveries of the Scientific Revolution helped unleash economic growth and greater competitiveness for the major European powers, particularly the UK. The ideas and methods that underpinned the revolution were applied to more and more fields through the movement known as the Enlightenment. The First Industrial Revolution. Beginning in the UK in the 1700s, freeing people to be inventive and productive and providing them with capital led many societies to shift to new machine-based manufacturing processes, creating the RST sustained and widespread period of productivity improvement in thousands of years. These improvements began with agricultural inventions that increased productivity, which led to a population boom and a secular shift toward urbanization as the labor intensity of farming declined. As people flocked to cities, industry benefited from the steadily increasing supply of labor, creating a virtuous cycle and leading to shifts in wealth and power both within and between nations. The new urban populations needed new types of goods and services, which required the government to get bigger and spend money on things like housing, sanitation, and education, as well as on the infrastructure for the new industrial capitalist system, such as courts, regulators, and central banks. Power moved into the hands of central government bureaucrats and the capitalists who controlled the means of production. Geopolitically, these developments most helped the UK, which pioneered many of the most important innovations. The UK caught up to the Netherlands in output per capita around 1800, before overtaking them in the mid-19th century, when the British Empire approached its peak share of world output. The Enlightenment and the Age of Revolutions. Also known as the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment was essentially the scientific method applied to how humans should behave. This way of thinking became widespread in Europe in the 1700s and 1800s and was an extension of the diminishing of the rights of the monarchy and the church and the increasing of the rights of the individual that characterized earlier intellectual movements. New fields like economics expanded thanks to thinkers like Adam Smith, while thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu pushed political philosophy in new directions. In particular, the Enlightenment ideas of these and other thinkers promoted rationality and individual liberties and undermined monarchic and religious powers, creating a movement toward overthrowing monarchies known as the Age of Revolutions. This wave of revolutions included the American, French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, and Italian. As is typical, this era of upheaval led some nations to seek out strong leaders who could bring order to the chaos. In the case of France, that leader was Napoleon, who changed the course not just of French history but of European history, as he sought to conquer all of Europe. Napoleon was the classic great benevolent dictator who converted chaos into order and prosperity, and expanded the empire with his military prowess. As is often the case, he overreached and failed. The Napoleonic Wars and the New World Order that followed, 1803-1815. The Napoleonic Wars lasted from 1803 to 1815, when Great Britain and its allies defeated Napoleon and his allies. As is usual, the victors got together to create a new world order, which was hashed out at the Congress of Vienna. It drew new boundaries to ensure that no European power would become too dominant, based on balance of power concepts that would avoid war. The British emerged as the world's leading empire. And as is typical after the war and the establishment of a new order, there was an extended period of peace and prosperity, the Pax Britannica. Western powers move into Asia. The British and other Western powers brought their gunboats to India, China, and Japan in the mid-1700s and into the 1800s, causing dramatic disruptions to the course of their histories. At the time, both China and Japan were isolationist. India was controlled by the Mughal Empire, which had expanded into a significant power in South Asia but experienced rapid decline in the 1700s. The Western powers, which were significantly more advanced militarily at this time, wanted to force trade on all three. The Chinese attempted to GHC the British but lost. The Japanese saw this and opened themselves for trade after U.S. Commander Matthew Perry sailed 4 warships into Tokyo Bay in 1853. These developments led to the eventual fall of the Qing dynasty, the resignation of the Japanese government, and the continued control of India by the British. Especially in Japan and China, it also led to the realization that they needed to modernize, which prompted the Meiji Restoration and the self-strengthening movement. This move was very successful in Japan and not successful in China, which continued to suffer in what the Chinese called the Century of Humiliation. Second Industrial Revolution. Beginning in the mid-1800s, a second big wave of innovation took place, centered at RST around steam-powered locomotion and then electricity, telephones, interchangeable manufacturing parts, and other innovations at the turn of the 20th century. Whereas the first industrial revolution was centered on the UK, the second industrial revolution primarily benefited the United States. As is typical, this period produced both great wealth and great wealth gaps and excesses in the capital markets, leading to an era known as the Gilded Age in the U.S. Invention of communism. The invention and development of communism in the mid-1800s came as a reaction against both capitalism and the wealth gaps it created and the benefits of the industrial revolutions going more to the owners of the new technologies than to the workers. Conflicts between communists and the established powers intensified around the turn of the century and led to a number of major revolutions in the 20th century, including in both Russia and China where communist governments took power. That brings us to the 20th century, which had two big cycles of boom, bust, wars, and new orders, the second of which we appear to be in the late stages of. Because I reviewed these comprehensively in chapters 10 through 13, and because they are much more familiar to most readers, I will end this overview here and dive now into the story of the Dutch and how they rose to become the RST global reserve currency empire. By the way, the existence of familial relationships in a Chinese dynasty should not be mistaken for loving and caring relationships, as, just like in Europe, GHTS between family members for control of dynasties were brutal and often to the death. The Medici family, who ruled and developed Florence during the period, acquired their wealth and power as business leaders and bankers. The Medici used their wealth, power, and smarts to acquire more wealth and power and to contribute enormously to the arts and sciences. They also acquired significant political power in Europe. For example, to gain power and or to provide public service, for popes came from the Medici family during their reign. A number of Medici were themselves artists and political leaders who looked to help not only the rich but also the middle and poorer classes in the city. However, like many multi-generational families and monarchies, after a few generations a weak head of the family and leader of the state, together with perceived excesses at a time of economic stress, led to a revolution. The Medici lost control of Florence on several occasions. While the Medici returned to power over the subsequent 3 centuries and the Renaissance continued, they struggled and failed in the mid-16th century as a result of wars, changing trade routes, and bad loan-making, which damaged their finances, and of changes in social norms and political practices. Chapter 9. The Big Cycle Rise and Decline of the Dutch Empire and the Guilder. After a series of attempted revolts in the mid-1500s, the Dutch, who were under the control of Habsburg Spain, narrowly became powerful enough to gain de facto independence in 1581. From 1625 until their collapse in 1795, the Dutch gained enough wealth and power to eclipse both the Habsburgs and China as the world's richest empire. The Dutch Empire rose for all the classic reasons explained in earlier chapters, peaking around 1650 in what is now remembered as the Dutch Golden Age. While its small population and territorial footprint prevented it from being the dominant military power on the European continent, it more than made up for that through a combination of economic strength, financial sophistication, and a strong navy that could protect its large empire of trading posts and colonies around the world. This allowed its currency, the Dutch guilder, to emerge as the RST global reserve currency. The following chart shows the 8 powers that fueled the Dutch ascent and eventual decline. What the chart doesn't show is the decline of the prior leading power, the Habsburg Empire, which you can see in the next chart depicting the entire arc of the Dutch Empire with key events noted. The numbers mark the approximate times of the 6 stages of the internal order cycle. The story begins with the decline of the Spanish Habsburgs, which initiated the RST stage of the Dutch Big Cycle. The transition from the Spanish Habsburg Empire to the Dutch Empire. New empires rise when old ones become weak and decadent. The story of the Dutch Empire began when the Habsburg Empire became weak, decadent, and overextended in all the classic ways. From 1519 until 1556, the Holy Roman Emperor and head of the Habsburg Empire was Charles V. The union of territories he controlled, which included most of modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Germany, Austria, and Spain, made the Habsburg Empire the most powerful family empire in Europe. Spain was especially strong because of the wealth and power it acquired in the age of exploration. The Spanish ET was clearly the most powerful navy in Europe. Spanish silver coinage came close to being a reserve currency. It was used as far ELD as China. Things began to change around the mid-1500s as the seeds of decline that were planted in the top phase began to germinate, and a revolutionary shift in power began to brew. The decline of the Habsburgs happened in many of the classic ways. There were revolutions against the elites who held wealth and power by those without them, challenging the existing order. For example, as I explained in the previous chapter, new religious ideas surfaced in the form of the Reformation, a revolution against the Roman Catholic Church, which was perceived as decadent and exploitative. At the time, the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire were a rich and powerful political force that was integral to the existing order. The revolution started when a collection of religious opposition groups, known generally as Protestantism, challenged the system. Martin Luther published his 95 Theses in 1517, challenging the papal interpretation of the Bible and papal power in general. When Luther refused to recant, he was declared a heretic and excommunicated. His ideas nonetheless took hold in large parts of Europe, thanks to the political support of key nobles, as well as Europe's new printing press technology. This came at an economically difficult time, when conflicts were intensifying, leading to instability and terrible civil wars, eventually culminating in the brutal 30 Years' War in the mid-1600s. Its biggest negative impact was on the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs. Charles V failed to prevent the revolutionary impacts of the Reformation, and with it the damage to the existing order. He was forced to sign the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which weakened the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg dynasty. He abdicated and divided his holdings in two, the Holy Roman Empire, which he passed to his brother Ferdinand, and most of the rest of the Habsburg Empire, most importantly Spain, but also the Netherlands, Belgium, significant portions of Italy, and Spanish colonies abroad, which he passed on to his son Philip II. From that point forward, the decline followed the classic script. The empire was overextended militarily. Not only did Spain face a lengthy revolt against its unpopular rule in the Netherlands, it also fought with the Ottoman Empire, various Italian states, the French, and the British. These wars were costly and chipped away at the Habsburg family dynasty even before the 30 Years' War. Terrible national nances caused the classic toxic mix of increased taxation, money printing, and rising debt. Philip II defaulted on debts 4 times during his reign. The lower and middle classes suffered from rising food prices, which were increasing at an unprecedented rate from the Spanish price revolution. Internal conflict grew, for all the previously mentioned reasons. Leadership deteriorated. Philip II and his son Philip III preferred lavish living to governing and ultimately used money printing to cover the large deficits, which led to high inflation and economic pain. Those around them behaved similarly. This chart shows the value of the most popular commonly circulating coin in silver terms. Adding cheap base metals to the monetary supply was the popular way to print and devalue money at the time. You can see it started in the early 1600s. The events of the 1500s were not the end of the Habsburg Empire, nor even to its claim to control the Netherlands. That wouldn't happen until the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. But they did create the conditions that allowed the Dutch to rise. The rise. From 1581 until around 1625, the Dutch Empire was built following the classic steps of a rising empire outlined in Chapter 1. More specifically, led by William the Silent, the Dutch successfully revolted against Spain in the 80 Years' War, which resulted in the Dutch Republic asserting its independence in 1581. William, who was basically the father of the Netherlands, was a skilled military commander and united the various Dutch provinces against the Spanish. While the Spanish and the Dutch continued to GHT over the subsequent decades, the Dutch were able to gain independence, and the seeds were sown for the rise of a more united Dutch Republic, particularly as Philip II cut out trade with the Dutch, forcing them to expand abroad on their own. Because the Republic was set up to allow each of the underlying provinces to maintain a high degree of sovereignty, the rise of the Dutch Empire was driven by a collective of statesmen rather than by a single monarch or leader. Though nobles held the most important roles, this system created checks and balances and a partnership that proved effective. Dutch values and culture emphasized education, saving, merit, and tolerance. The break from Spain allowed the Dutch to create a more open and inventive society. The Dutch invented ships that could go around the world to collect riches, capitalism that could finance these and other productive endeavors, and many more breakthroughs that made them rich and powerful. The Dutch created the world's RST megacorporation, the Dutch East India Company, which accounted for about 1/3 of world trade. Dutch openness to new ideas, people, and technology helped them rise quickly. To support trade, the Dutch government increased military investments, which allowed the country to control still more trade by holding the British in a number of military conflicts. The Dutch also created the world's RST reserve currency other than gold and silver, the Dutch guilder, supported by an innovative banking and currency system put into place via the establishment of the Bank of Amsterdam. As a result of these classic and sound fundamental steps, the Dutch became rich. Income per capita in the Netherlands rose to over twice that of most other European powers. The Dutch continued to invest heavily in education and infrastructure to build on their successes. Dutch literacy rates reached twice the world average. They continued to develop their capital markets, and Amsterdam became the world's most important financial center. The Dutch did all of this with a population of only 1-2 million people. The following charts provide some perspective on the unique nature of Dutch education, innovation, and trade in the 1600s and the impact these forces had on Dutch incomes, all of which we will explore later in this chapter. In short, the Dutch were superbly educated people who were very hardworking and inventive. In fact, they came up with about a quarter of all major inventions in the world when they were at their peak, a spike that began shortly before Dutch independence from Spain. To reiterate, the two most important inventions they came up with were 1. Uniquely active sailing ships that could take them all around the world, which, with the military skills they acquired from the guiding they did in Europe, allowed them to collect great riches. And 2. The capitalism that fueled these endeavors.